Hello, you're listening to 197th special episode of Web Standard Podcast. I'm your host, Vadim Makeev from HTML Academy. This episode is supported by FrontendConf, and today we have a special guest, Léonie Watson. Hello, Léonie, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, I'm Léonie Watson. I run an accessibility and inclusive design company called Tetralogical, and when I'm not doing that, I spend a lot of time in the web standards world, doing things at the W3C, where I'm co-chair of a couple of working groups and also involved in a lot of the accessibility activity. In case it isn't already obvious, those are all things I like to talk about a very great deal, which is what brings me to Moscow and the FrontEnd conference, which I'm really looking forward to. Should be a great chance to meet up with lots of people and talk about development and accessibility.
Yeah, FrontEnd Conf is taking place in Moscow on October 13th to 14th. I'm going to speak there myself. So we'll have a chance to meet in person. But actually, I saw you a few years ago in Yekaterinburg in Russia, so it's not your first time.
No, it's not. I've had the good fortune to come to Russia 2 or 3 times so far, and I've always really enjoyed it. So I'm very happy to be coming back to Moscow.
Was it Moscow, Yekaterinburg, and some other city?
And St. Petersburg.
Oh, yeah. So you got the best three cities in St. Petersburg,
right?
In the whole Russia. So that's good. I'm going to ask you to do some short introduction into your talk because you're focusing on accessibility, but it's not going to be the obvious accessibility introduction talk. You're going to dive a bit deeper and maybe look at the future.
Yes, that's right. So one of the areas I'm interested in now is web component and how we make sure that we build those to be accessible. That means that we've got a lot of old problems that we are facing again, but also some new challenges. One of the ways we might solve some of those challenges is a very new technology called the Accessibility Object Model, AOM. It's still in development, but if it achieves what it's intended for, it may give us some really interesting ways to build accessibility into custom elements and web components.
All right, so AOM, what's your interest? Like you're trying to build something based on web components, or you're taking part in some standardization bodies to make it compatible with accessibility?
So I'm interested from the development point of view, as in using the AOM. The AOM itself is being developed by Google and Apple and Mozilla, and the people working on it are very aware of accessibility. They really know what they're talking about. So the spec is in safe hands from that point of view. But what I'm interested in is making it easier for developers to create stuff that's accessible. At the moment, we have a very awkward situation. If we want to build a custom control of any kind, if we start with div and span elements, then we have to use ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, roles and attributes to polyfill the missing accessibility information. And we have to apply that into the HTML and then let the browser take that information and make it available to assistive technologies like screen readers. So it's a bit of an awkward way to code things. Your HTML code gets very cluttered. What the AOM wants to achieve is to let us apply that accessibility information directly into the browser using JavaScript. So we don't need to put all these attributes into our HTML. We can just add that accessibility information in directly using JavaScript. So it's a much neater way of doing things. Your code gets to stay cleaner. And I think for most of us, using JavaScript to do these things is more familiar than anything. So I'm hopeful it'll make accessibility feel more familiar to developers too.
Yeah, I personally agree with this because sometimes applying not just area roles, maybe area labels to your HTML, it's not that complicated, but sometimes applying some relationships between different elements like labeled by and adding some IDs into your code, that might be cumbersome.
Right. And there are several phases to the AOM. The first is just reflecting the roles and attributes. So instead of having to write JavaScript like element.setAttribute button, role, we can just do element.role equals button. So the syntax of the JavaScript becomes a lot more familiar, and those attributes just get reflected back pretty much in the same way we do everything else in JavaScript these days. The next phase actually solves the problem you've just talked about. What they want to do, and this is still in development, is to get away from having to put IDs on everything for referencing with ARIA labeled by or ARIA described by. Again, so you can just refer to the object in the JavaScript without needing to use an ID reference at all. That's proving a bit of a difficult one to solve, though lots of really smart people from the browser companies are trying to figure it out. But it's that one's still in the planning and figuring out stages.
All right. Let's take a step back and go back to web components. Typical use case for web components, or maybe not use case, but typical way developers apply those would be a custom element and some shadow DOM inside of it just to isolate things inside. Mm-hmm. And how screen readers currently treat such elements in your markup?
Screen readers will treat them as well as they've been built. It's exactly the same. If you were going to create any kind of custom control on the web today, whether it was a web component or not, the accessibility depends entirely on how well it's been built. And that's the same with web components. If someone creates a custom element with or without the shadow DOM and they build good accessibility into it, screen readers will have no trouble with it at all, or any other assistive technologies or keyboard users. If these things are built badly, then of course we run into the problems we've had for always on the web.
But is it possible to extend some existing HTML elements to inherit accessibility role?
It is, but unfortunately, there is a big problem with that. When you create custom elements, there are two sorts that you can create. Customized custom element, and that lets you take an existing HTML element and extend it. So yes, you get all the inherited accessibility values from that original element. The problem with that is that, two problems. One is that the HTML code you have to write is pretty ugly. So if we wanted to extend the button element in our HTML, we'd put in a button element, but then we'd have the is equals attribute, and that would give the name of the custom element we'd created. And a lot of people don't like that kind of syntax. The other bigger problem is that WebKit doesn't support customized custom elements. So if you go down that route at the moment, there's a big chunk of the particularly mobile market that you're not going to be able to support without more polyfills. So that leaves us with the other kind of custom elements known as autonomous custom elements. They unfortunately all just inherit from the base HTML element. So they don't inherit any accessibility characteristics at all. You have to build them all in for yourself as the developer. And that's where the AOM starts to become really useful, because even in its early form, the AOM will make that a lot easier. And more importantly, it'll encapsulate the accessibility inside the web component, inside the custom element, like all the other characteristics will.
All right. That sounds like you're basically creating a div and then you have to make it accessible yourself.
It's exactly that, it's kind of why I said sometimes this feels very familiar. It's the same problems we've been dealing with for years. It's just that the kind of the location has changed. So yeah.
All right. I remember using element.className for manipulating class names by basically stitching together strings and replacing and things like that. But then ClassList API appeared in the browsers, and it made manipulating class names on elements much easier. So you can add, toggle, replace, or check if there is a class name applied to an element and things like that. So basically it was an improvement to DOM API. AOM looks to me familiar, and it looks similar to this change. We're making ARIA first-class citizen in our JavaScript code, so we have a chance to work it with a bit more convenient way.
It's exactly right. Yes, and I think you've described it very well. Making it a first-class citizen, I think, is brilliant description of what it is.
All right, but is it just I don't like calling it syntactic sugar, but yeah, is it just a way to write existing ARIA easier in more convenient way, or it's bigger than that?
It will be much bigger than that. At the moment, it's just that ability to apply the ARIA in a better way syntactically. But I mentioned before, there are several phases to the AOM. Once we get past the alternatives to using ID references, things get really interesting. They want to add specific input events for assistive technologies. So one problem that exists at the moment is if you create a custom slider and you want to be able to increment it or decrement it, it's not possible to make that accessible when a screen reader is running on iOS, for example, because the right events don't exist. So they want to add in a very small number of new events that will apply specifically when an AT is running. So increment, decrement, scroll up, scroll down, or another couple of examples. After that, things get even more interesting in that the AOM will let you basically create entire new sections of what's known as the accessibility tree in the browser. So at the moment, when a page loads in the browser creates the DOM, and it'll then, if an assistive technology is running, create a sister structure called the accessibility tree. And the DOM and the accessibility tree are very closely related. They're essentially the same thing, but the accessibility tree has all the accessibility information like role, name, state, about the code that's in the page. What the AOM will let you do is actually add to that accessibility tree directly. Developers have never been able to do that. Even now, it's only the browsers that can create that structure. But what the AOM, in theory, will let us do is add information to the accessibility tree directly. And that's both really scary and really exciting. It's scary because there is a very big possibility that we'll end up with a complete split between what's displayed in the DOM on screen and what is in the accessibility tree. What's exciting about it is that it will enable us to solve a lot of problems. So at the moment, if we take the canvas element, that will write pixels to the screen, but there's no semantic information to it whatsoever. In theory, with the AOM, we'd be able to inject all the accessibility information for the content straight into the accessibility tree, which would have the potential to make that kind of content much more accessible. And if we look even further afield, when we get into XR content, virtual reality, augmented reality on the web, it's quite possible that the AOM will be a big part of the solution of making that more accessible to screen reader users too.
Speaking of accessibility tree, so this thing, I guess, exists in every browser at the moment. It's obviously not writable, but is it possible to get information from it somehow or not?
Not as developers, no. So yes, every browser does do this, but at the moment, the only things that can get access to that information are assistive technologies. And to do that, they use something called platform accessibility APIs. These APIs have been around for 20 or more years now, and they're the conventional way that screen readers and other assistive technologies query information from the operating system, from applications, and from web content. That won't change. The screen readers, the assistive technologies will still use those APIs to query information from the browser. The only difference is now, or at least in the future when the AOM happens, is that developers will be able to manipulate and read from that accessibility tree too. So it'll open up essentially what's been a pretty closed relationship so far.
I'm trying to imagine this situation. I have an empty body with a canvas element on it with some ID and a huge chunk of JavaScript connecting and trying to draw something on it. Yeah, that's super inaccessible. That's terrible. But if you apply AOM and you start building accessibility tree all over it, you can pass some information. You can build some UI and pass this information to screen reader, for example. But it won't be accessible via keyboard.
Right.
So it's not an ultimate solution.
No, it's not. The accessibility tree is very much focused on assistive technologies, mostly screen readers, but also screen magnifiers, speech recognition. The AOM, because it focuses on ARIA, is perhaps a bit more focused on screen readers. But you're absolutely right. Being able to add information to the accessibility tree will only help assistive technology users. It's not going to help people with other disabilities who would also struggle, like keyboard users, as you say.
But what might be the solution for such situation? Like you have a game or some sort of XR experience that's just being drawn on GPU, and you have to make it accessible to keyboard in a way. What would be the solution for that?
That's a very good question. There's actually a workshop taking place in Seattle in the beginning of November that I've been co-organizing with the W3C, where we're going to try and look at some of these questions, particularly around XR content. Where are the gaps? And there are big gaps in the accessibility of that kind of content. And some conversations at another W3C event 2 or 3 weeks ago in Japan suggests that actually we may need to think of completely new solutions, trying to make old ways of interacting with content work in the XR space may not be a good idea. We might have to completely rethink how how interaction works, how assistive technology works. There are a lot of really big questions, but somehow that's a really great time to be involved in a conversation when anything is possible.
Oh yeah, but still, this AOM thing is a huge step forward in this direction.
I think it will be. Yes, there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. I mentioned that, the first phase, the attribute and element reflection, it has support in Safari shipping and Chrome behind the flag. And so I think Microsoft and Mozilla will hopefully soon implement the next phase, not having to use ID references. That's causing some problems. There's some thinking that still needs to be done there. The rest is all in the future. And there are still some very big questions. Privacy is one area. Once this capability to access the accessibility tree becomes available to developers, it will be very easy for a website to identify when the person consuming the website is using an assistive technology. Coupled with some other information, it's pretty straightforward then to tell that they're using a screen reader or a magnifier or a speech recognition tool. And from there, of course, you can make some reasonably good guesses as to what that person's disability is. So, on the one hand, the argument is that it will give us the capability to make things a lot better for people who use those kind of assistive technologies. On the other hand, of course, I don't trust advertising companies. So I don't want them getting hold of that information just based on the fact I'm interacting with an advert or using a website.
But this happening with every new technology. Basically, we introduce into web platform. It could be used in both ways, like almost every time.
Yeah, it really could. I think there's an interesting dynamic with accessibility, though, in that there's a real sense that, if we know you're a blind person, we can make your experience better, as opposed to if I know you're a blind person, I could discriminate against you in some way. In other areas, if we asked people to give up that level of personal information, there'd be a pretty strong argument against doing it because the benefits almost certainly don't outweigh the concerns. With the accessibility argument, it's really hard to make that call because there are amazing benefits that could be taken from letting people let go of that sort of bit of private information. So yeah, it's a lot harder to find the right solution, I think, in this case.
All right, I have a few practical questions I'd like to ask you because I teach some basic HTML and CSS to students at HTML Academy, but sometimes I struggle with some use cases for UI elements. One of the example is modal pop-ups. It's really hard to make them accessible in a good way. I know there used to be a dialog element and still available, I believe, in Chromium, but it's not available in other browsers. And polyfills are a bit complex. And also there used to be somewhere in a spec there used to be inert attribute. There are some script that allows you to do like focus traps and things like that. But it's always it's so fragile. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of time to build the proper experience. Is there any good way of making modal elements, or we should just avoid them?
I think the answer is there are good ways and there are easy ways.
All right.
but they're not necessarily the same thing. So the inert attribute hasn't gone away. Actually, some of the people behind the AOM have been recently trying to get support for that, get it into the spec, and I think that would really help. It's a really useful way of preventing people from getting it at the underlying page content when a modal is open.
Yeah, basically you're applying inert attribute and everything inside of this DOM element turns off interactivity altogether. So basically what you have is just your dialog or your pop-up. You don't even have to create those focus traps because everything you have is your modal dialog and it's truly modal.
Yep, absolutely. Beyond that, should you not use them at all? No, I don't think so. I actually think modals are useful because the alternative is almost certainly to have people open the modal content in a new browser tab. And, that used to happen a lot, back in the day. Used to have new browser windows opening all the time and it was horrible. Used to drive everybody to distraction. So I think modals have kind of stopped that practice and that's a good thing.
So instead of going to another page to log in, you can do it right there by clicking the login button.
I think there are sort of some use cases are better than others. If it's a login, I'm not convinced that a modal is necessary.
All right.
Actually, going to a login page or just revealing, the login form, inline on the page. I've seen that pattern. You click on a login button and just the fields show up just right there on the page. I think for login, something like that, there are probably better ways to do it than a modal. But if you just want to quickly get someone's attention, get them to acknowledge something or fill in a quick bit of information, there are reasonable use cases for having a modal. But as you say, they're not easy things to create accessibly. You've got a lot of keyboard handling to deal with. There's some kind of debate over where do you put keyboard focus when the modal opens. Should it be on the container for the dialog? Should it be on the close button? Does there need to be a close button? All these things. Yeah. So it's like most of the web. It's complicated.
Oh yeah, that's why we have conferences, podcasts, and things like that. We're not just doing our job silently. All right, and then another question I often get asked by students. Imagine a very complicated dialogue. It's not a model, it's just a pop-up, for example, with calendar, with some way to navigate between months and years, seeing holidays and things like that. So super complicated, super easy to use if you're fully capable of using mouse, if you see the interface, and yeah. But if you're not able to see the interface, you have to go through the whole widget and learn it because you're seeing it for the first time. And wouldn't it be easier for screen reader users or for a blind person to just have input type text where they can enter date in text format?
Yes, I think it is. And that's something I always recommend. Provide the calendar, the date picker, in the visual sense, because that's going to make it a lot easier for some people. But yes, it's always good to just give people the alternative to type in the date. The one exception to that, or it's not an exception, I would always recommend that. But the one time that maybe doesn't serve the purpose you want is when you don't know what date you need to enter. So if you're in a calendar and you're just creating an appointment, because you've got a meeting next Thursday at 10 o'clock, that's fine. You can enter that information. But if you're maybe looking to book a flight for your summer holiday and you want to leave on a Saturday in June next year, but you don't know what date that is, that's when it gets more helpful, I think, to be able to scroll through or, use the keyboard to just move through months so you can find out what that date is. That doesn't necessarily change that you should make a text box available. I just think that's always a good thing to do regardless. But again, the context of why someone is entering a date makes a difference too.
But sometimes those pop-ups are just forcing you to use them. That's the problem, I think.
Right.
If you're able to, if you know the date, you can just type it. It doesn't matter if you have special needs, accessibility needs, or you're just, I don't know, it's easier for you to type than click.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing you have to do if you're going to add in that text box, though, is two things, actually. Firstly, be very clear what format the date needs to be entered in. So make sure that users know it's DD/MM/YYY or...
Would placeholder help?
Yes and no. So placeholders will help visually, but they're not very good from an accessibility point of view. Most browsers put the placeholder text in at a very low visual contrast. So if you have low vision or you're colorblind or anything like that, then the placeholder text is often difficult to see. As soon as you type into the field, the placeholder text disappears. So if you have any trouble remembering stuff, as soon as you've typed into the box, you've lost that bit of helpful information. And screen readers don't play well with placeholders in some browsers. So it's okay to do it, but it shouldn't be the only way you provide that information.
So somewhere in the label?
Yeah, the pattern I like is just to make the label enter date and then to use ARIA described by to associate, please enter the date in this format. So visually, it's associated close to the edit box. So it makes sense for someone looking at it. From a screen reader user's point of view, when you focus on that text field, you'll hear enter date, edit field, please enter the date in blah, blah, blah format. So you get a nice kind of little package of information that sets you right up.
All right. So if you would summarize it, then it's okay to have some additional interfaces inaccessible if there is a simpler, convenient way of doing things.
Definitely. That's one of the oldest kind of principles of accessibility is people prefer to do things in different ways. So supporting that makes sense. If you look back to some of the earliest accessibility guidelines in 1999, providing things in multiple ways was one of the guidelines back then. And that was just the simple idea that, put a cert facility on a website, have the main navigation, and, let people browse a site tree, because people prefer to do things in different ways. So making that possible is a good thing to do. And that really, site trees, not so much these days, but giving people choices, that's really important. That's good inclusive design, not just accessibility.
No, that's true. And back to AOM, it's the thing that would make using ARIA for JavaScript developers especially easier.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason it exists. But what are the challenges in front of ARIA and accessibility movement in general? Maybe developer awareness, browser support. What's the biggest problem these days?
So one of the other things that the AOM was created to solve is that at the moment, when you create a web component, a custom element, and even when you've applied your ARIA, when you go and inspect your custom element in the DOM, you'll see all the ARIA attributes have leaked out into the DOM. Everything else stays encapsulated inside the custom element, inside the web component, but not the accessibility. So that's one of the things the AOM wants to achieve, is to encapsulate the accessibility in the same way that other characteristics of web components are contained neatly inside. So for example, if you just use a normal HTML button element, the browser makes that focusable with a keyboard by default. It gives it a role of button by default. And if you go and have a look at the button element in the DOM, you don't see any of those attributes. You don't see a tab index attribute or a role attribute. All that accessibility is just encapsulated within the button element. So it's one of the things the AOM wants to do is make that same level of encapsulation for accessibility possible in custom elements, which I think will be nice. In terms of ARIA generally, they've been working really hard, the working group, on what they're calling role parity. So this is something else that came out of the web components world, because the idea of a web component is that we can pretty much start from scratch. We start from that base HTML element. The web components people wanted to make it possible to apply any of the semantics you can get in HTML at the moment to a custom element. So the ARIA working group have been busy adding roles to the ARIA spec so that sooner or later there should be more or less complete parity. So for every HTML element that has a strong role, there should be an ARIA equivalent. And that's been a huge undertaking. They've been doing that for perhaps 2 or 3 years now, and there's still more work to be done. Interesting things going on there too.
All right. But what should we do in education, for example, to make ARIA a bit more accessible to developers? Because I think it's the part of the problem.
So I think we have what we in the United Kingdom call a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have that phrase in Russia, but it basically means we need to solve one thing to solve the other.
Oh, yeah.
And we need to solve the other to solve the first thing. And the reason I think people find ARIA difficult is because they're not familiar with it. They don't understand how the mechanics work in the browser. They don't really understand how assistive technologies work. And so to get people better at using ARIA, we've got to teach people more about it. When you think about it, HTML is not easy. CSS is reasonably complex these days. JavaScript's, incredibly variable and complicated. So many different frameworks, so many different styles, structures, formats. And yet we can all learn and understand how to use those things because we're familiar with them. So I think we've got to get ARIA and accessibility to the same point where people are familiar with it and so they can use it properly. It's not any more complicated than anything else we do. It's just that we do it less often and people are taught less about it. So it seems unfamiliar, and because it's unfamiliar, it seems harder. And because that's the case.
Yeah, I guess we just should start earlier.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When you were talking about your work at the HTML Academy, where we need to start is actually not in the accessibility courses, but in the HTML and CSS and JavaScript courses. Everything we teach in those kinds of courses should just be accessible by default.
Oh yeah, that's we have accessibility lecture, which is third. Like first they hear about HTML for the first time, the second some sort of introduction, and then HTML accessibility. So I'm talking about what is keyboard navigation, what is accessibility, what is screen reader. We are not just using browsers. There's something else. So yeah, we start early.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing we as a community need to do is we need to get better at, when we talk about code design development, when we write about it, when we blog about it, we all have a responsibility to make sure that the examples we put in our blog posts and our articles and our conference talks are just accessible by default, even if we're not talking about accessibility. the code that we put into our slides and the things that we share should just show good accessibility as standard, because the more we can just make it normality, when people come and they borrow our code examples or they use our demos, if they're accessible just because, then that accessibility kind of carries through. So I think that's what needs to change. I think we all just need to get better at being accessible by default, so people just pick that up and carry it forward.
Going back to challenges in front of ARIA, I think this year, or maybe it was the year when Safari finally applied role content info to footer element.
Right.
And it took them a while. And I wonder what's the browser support for such roles or for such features of ARIA in general, because it seems to me like it's not number one priority for them, but they're slowly getting there.
In terms of pure ARIA, actually, I don't think support is too bad. The trouble is that nobody has really documented this. We've got can I use for HTML support and other features. There is a project that has spun up recently, a crowdsourced project, which is trying to close that gap. Like all crowdsourced project, it's dependent on the goodwill of the community, and that's always a risk.
I just recently saw this Ali Support IO.
Right.
Yeah,
that's it.
This one. All right.
And it's a terrific resource. It's really useful, and some of the best information we've got. But I'm a screen reader user myself. Internet Explorer is a write-off in terms of accessibility. It's dreadful, but it's pretty much a dying browser anyway, so it's not going to get any better. As for the rest of the browsers, they all do things a bit differently, and they've all got different levels of support. But there's a pretty good core level of ARIA support, I think. As new attributes get added, it takes time, for that support to come in. So a reasonably new attribute is ARIA role description, which will let you change the way an assistive technology announces a particular role. And it's quite a useful attribute, but support for that at the moment is still quite inconsistent. So, but give it time and things will catch up. The same as we see for, most things. You might remember when HTML5 was new, it took a long time for all the browsers to add support for the new elements that came in. Some of them still hasn't. The original Edge, for example, still doesn't support details and summary. So I'm not sure that accessibility is any different to any other area of kind of front-end language. There are always going to be things I think that the browsers are more interested in, find more interesting and put more resources into, and things that perhaps are lower priority. But I think accessibility is holding its own.
All right. So it feels to you that they are paying some attention. Maybe not enough. It's always not enough, but... So
I think, I know people from the accessibility teams at Apple, Google, Mozilla, Microsoft, and they're not always the biggest teams in the company, but they're pretty committed teams, and they're very smart and capable people. And actually, having a small team of smart and capable people often counts for a lot more than a big team of not so smart and committed people. I don't mean to offend any other teams at those companies, but the accessibility teams are, they're really good at what they do. They know what they're doing, and they work pretty damn hard to get it right.
Okay, so we have some bright future in front of us, right?
I think so. Yeah.
You were listening to 197th special episode of Web Standard Podcast. Thank you to FrontendConf for supporting our podcast, and thank you, Léonie, for joining us today.
It's been a lot of fun, and I hope I will see everyone at FrontendConf. Please do come and say hello, and if you have any questions you think I can help with, just ask away. I'd be really happy.
See you there as well, and thank you for listening. See you next week in the regular Russian-speaking episode. Bye.